Hello, Unravelers. Welcome back to Tiff Unraveled. If you're new here, then welcome. I'm Tiff, and I'm so happy to have you. This time of year, the world is trimming their trees. Everyone's sipping some hot cocoa. Everyone's, hiding all that doom and gloom under the guise of twinkly lights. But here on Tiff Unraveled, you and me, we know better. This time of year, the nights, they start to stretch a little longer. The air becomes a little bit more still. But that is when the darkness gets a little bit louder. Here on Tiff Unraveled, we're not decking the halls, we're dusting them for prints. Every week, we're going to unwrap a new name on the naughty list. And these are not the kinds of names that belong in Christmas carols. They belong in case files. So, pour a drink, lean in close, dim the lights, because 'tis the cereal season. So every week from now until Christmas, we are going to unravel a serial killer. Maybe one that has fascinated me for a long time, or maybe one that I've just learned about and read about. Today's, though, I've known about for a long time, and maybe you have too. But for tonight, I need you to picture a place of almost absurd contradictions. We're talking about Anchorage, Alaska in the 1970s and 1980s. On one hand, you have this staggering postcard wilderness, right? Like perfect, beautiful wilderness. It's the land of the midnight sun. There are these beautiful snow-capped mountains. There are these vast, silent forests. And there is a sky so big that it just feels like it could swallow you right up. But on the other hand, thanks to the construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline at that time, Anchorage was becoming a boom town. And I kind of mean that in like the sleaziest way possible, okay? It became a city that was flooded with oil money and roughnecks, which in turn started to attract a massive vice economy. The city's underbelly at this time was suddenly just teeming with prostitutes, with pimps, with drug dealers, and with con artists. It had become a magnet for people without roots or without ties to a community. People who, if they vanished in that very vast, silent wilderness, well, it might be a while before anyone noticed that they were gone. And in the middle of this very cold, chaotic city, there was a man who most people actually thought couldn't have been more boring. This man's name was Robert Hansen, but everyone in his community just knew him as Bob the Baker. Of course they did. Bob the Baker. He was the quintessential, unassuming local businessman. He owned a very popular bakery downtown. He was married. He had 2 kids. To the community, he was just a mousy, they described him as mousy, scrawny guy with this very mild stutter. The local cops were actually regulars at his bakery. They would very often stop in for their coffee and their pastries. He was harmless. He was a model citizen. He was a baker. But here's the thing about Tiff Unraveled. We don't do episodes about harmless bakers, do we? So while Bob Hansen was selling pastries to police officers in Anchorage, he was also living a very secret, parallel life. A life that involved his other great passion, hunting. And to service that passion, he actually ended up buying a small bush plane. It was a Piper Super Cub. I had to look up what this was. That's what it is. This is the plane, okay? So For 12 long years, as women began to disappear from the edges of Anchorage society, no one ever thought to connect their disappearance to this very mild-mannered baker. They didn't know at that time that after hours, Bob the baker would fire up the engine of that plane. He would fly these women into the very vast Alaskan wilderness. And then, with his very high powered hunting rifle, he would hunt them. And no, that's not a metaphor. He hunted them like animals. Tonight's story is the story of Robert Hansen, the butcher baker, the only serial killer in history that we know of that used an airplane to turn the Alaskan wilderness into his own private, sadistic hunting reserve. So, how does a man like this happen? How does this happen? How does a stuttering baker from Iowa become a human trophy hunter? Well, to unravel this one, we've got to go all the way back to the beginning, as one usually must do to understand cases like this one. Back to the place where this monster was built. We have to go where I don't know why so many cases that I cover take me to Iowa. Robert Christian Hansen was born on February the 15th, 1939 in Esterville, Iowa. And to call his childhood difficult would definitely be an understatement here. His youth was not just a sad story. It actually really was a sad story, but it also was this perfect pathogenic storm for creating a predator. From the very start, Robert Hansen was a quiet loner type, and life seemed pretty determined to make him one. He was afflicted with two things that are, let's be honest, social death for a teenage boy. He had a debilitating, severe stutter, and he had a severe case of acne so bad that it actually left him with permanent, like, pockmark riddled scars. At school, Robert was a walking target. He was mocked, he was humiliated every single day, every day. And this relentless torment, especially from the girls that he tried to socialize with, as every teenage boy has the desire to do, it just devastated his confidence. He felt completely inadequate. He felt completely inept. And his stutter was this constant physical manifestation of, like, his powerlessness. He literally could not exert himself. And his home life, well, it was no refuge. In fact, it might have arguably been worse than his school life. He was born into a very strict, religious, and very devoutly conforming family. His father, whose name was Christian Hansen, was a Danish immigrant and was also the town baker. He was a very hard-nosed authoritarian who ruled with an iron fist. Robert was ridiculed by this very domineering man, and from a very early age, he was forced to work very grueling hours at the family bakery. He felt caged in, and he felt completely powerless under his father's control. He had absolute control. To make matters even weirder, Hansen was actually naturally left-handed, but his parents forced him to use his right hand, which added another layer of control, another way to make Robert feel vulnerable and, like, just feel like he was wrong, intrinsic, like he was just innately wrong as a human being, right? So at home, he's powerless against his father. And then at school, he's completely powerless against his bullies, right? And this is where the psychology just gets really dark, right? He's trapped between two toxic models. Model number one, the male, right? His father, aggressive, domineering, all powerful, right? And then model number two, the female, His mother, Edna, he used to observe her very acquiescent attitude, as it has been described, her like, yeah, saying, always like, following his father's commands, never really standing up for him, and always just like, yes, 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 in response to that domineering male. And in his mind, I think that really cemented a core belief. Women are very weak and very easily manipulated and subjugated. This is the script right here. This emotional abuse that he endured created this blueprint for his entire criminal life. He would spend the rest of his days pathologically enacting this dynamic. He would become that hard-nosed authoritarian, and he would force his victims, right, the weak and easily subjugated, into that role. This collection of torments, right? The stutter, the acne, the bullying, the father, it created this core wound of total abject powerlessness. And in that wound, something begins to fester. He later admits that his homicidal tendencies were born in these, quote, tortured adolescent years, unquote. He developed a very intense fantasy life where he dreamed of, quote, doing things to the girls who had rejected him, unquote. Spoiler alert, Robert Hansen was not okay. He was not okay. Unable to find acceptance anywhere, he found refuge in solitary activities, things that gave him a sense of control and competence, right? Things that he found out he was good at. What were those things? Hunting, fishing, archery. Remember that. He graduated high school. He did end up graduating high school. His name was actually misspelled in his high school yearbook, right? Just as a final screw you from the town. He joined the Army Reserve. He stayed there for a year, and then he came back to Iowa. He worked in his father's bakery. He did actually even end up becoming a drill sergeant for the junior police. Oh, the irony. And in 1960, he actually even got married. And so it looked for at least a second that he might just become this normal but repressed kind of guy. But on December 7th, 1960, that festering rage finally erupted. This was his first classic, like, feeder crime, right? A symbolic act of power and revenge. I think he set fire to the school bus garage in his hometown. And I really just don't think this was vandalism, right? Or like just, no. I think that this for him was the first time that he was able to lash out at the community and all of the institutions that he felt like had humiliated him or hated him. He was actually sentenced to 3 years in prison. He ended up serving 20 months. And while he was inside, his first wife, unsurprisingly, divorced him. When he got out, he met and married his second wife in 1963. And in 1967, the couple decided that they needed a fresh start. They needed to find a place where they could just escape all of this judgment of small town Iowa. They packed their bags and they moved as far away as they possibly could to Anchorage, Alaska. Unfortunately, though, Bob here didn't leave his pathology behind. He just kind of replanted it in the permafrost. In Anchorage, Robert Hansen didn't just rebuild his life. He actually perfected that mask of sanity. He opens his bakery, and Bob the Baker was born. He had 2 children with his wife. He is, by all accounts, a pillar of the community. This very meek and mild demeanor, this stutter that he had, this scrawny harmlessness that he presented. It was the perfect invisibility cloak. It was so good, as we'll see, that it would actually later cause police to look a surviving handcuffed victim in the face and instead believe the stuttering baker's alibi. But we'll get there. This repeated success at fooling the system was a critical part of his psychology. It fed a very increasingly narcissistic belief in his own superiority. But While Bob the baker was serving pastries, his other self was thriving. It was thriving in Alaska. He became an avid hunter. He'd always had this affinity for those solo activities like we talked about hunting, fishing, archery. But when he moved to Alaska, he honed that skill. And I need you to understand, he wasn't just some weekend warrior, right? The man was a world-class marksman and archer. Like, his animal skills were so impressive that he was actually entered into Pope and Young's trophy hunting world record books on multiple occasions. 1969, 1970, and 1971. Like, this man was good at this sport. And so to facilitate this hobby, he got his pilot's license, but it actually maybe turned out that he never even got his pilot's license, which is just a whole other level of sociopathic confidence, right? Anyway, he bought his infamous plane, that Piper Super Cub we talked about. This might be the most terrifying part of his psychology. This was not a double life, right? It actually, to me, was like a convergence of the two lives. His public identity as this trophy hunter was the practice and the rehearsal, right, for his private identity as human trophy hunter. The skills that he had honed, right? Tracking, stalking, killing, the tools he had mastered, the rifle, the plane, the mindset he had acquired, right? The thrill of the chase, the dehumanization of prey, the collection of trophies. They were all identical in both lives. His life wasn't actually one of contradiction. It was one of very terrifying, singular focus. And just like in Iowa, that monster started to bubble up. The system in Alaska, it had its chances. You know, we always talk about the system. We'll talk about the system here too. The system in Alaska had its chances because in 1971, the baker was arrested for the assault and attempted rape of a housewife. I'm keeping that in the video.
Oh, really?
Yeah, slay.
Because I'm just gonna have to sneeze.
Love you. But that rape charge, it was dropped in a plea bargain. And yeah, he got off light. But then in 1976, he was arrested again for larceny. He had stolen a chainsaw. He was sentenced to 5 years, and he was even required in that sentencing, he was required to get psychiatric treatment for what they called manic depression, but his sentence was reduced. He was released with time served, of course. And then there was another theft charge in 1977 and another 5-year sentence, of which he served 1 year. He had gotten one over on not only the system, but even his psychiatrist yet again, right? Everybody thought he was good to go. The lenient sentences that he got, to him, was a flashing green light. Green light. Go, Bob, go. Catastrophic. He learned 2 critical lessons from this, I think. First, from the 1971 assault, he learned don't target housewives. Don't target women with roots or community ties. Don't do that. He very quickly learned to target the people that he thought would go more unnoticed, right? People like strippers, people like prostitutes that were abundant during this pipeline Zoom, right? Women who were maybe harder to keep track of, and of course, less likely to be missed. And second, he learned that his mousy little stuttering baker mask was impenetrable. He could fool anyone. He could fool anyone, and he did. He did. And here's the single most damning fact of this entire case. Legal reviews actually later determined that 3 of the 4 murders that Robert Hansen was eventually convicted for were committed, quote, during the time in which he should have been serving his jail sentence, unquote, for all of those prior offenses. Of course, systemic failures all around. You get a systemic failure. You get a systemic failure. You get a systemic failure. Merry fucking Christmas. But that systemic failure didn't just enable this monster. It actually functionally allowed him to just be free and begin his killing spree in earnest. For Bob the Baker, the hunt was on. So let's talk about the modus operandi, because there has never been another one quite like this one. It all started in Anchorage's Tenderloin district, right? The strip club and the bar scene that he knew was the perfect hunting ground. Um, Step one, the lure. He would approach a sex worker or an exotic dancer with an offer. It was almost always the same offer. He would offer $300 for a photo shoot or for sex. Step two was the abduction. Once the woman was inside that vehicle, the mask was gone. It was gone. He would abduct her. Um, Often at gunpoint. He would use handcuffs. He would use blindfolds. Sometimes he would even take them to his house, to his home, as he did with Cindy Paulson, who we'll talk about later. And he would chain them in his den for repeated assaults. He would torture them. He would assault them. He would torture them. Step three, the annihilation. This is key. His infamous plane that we've mentioned 2 or 3 times already, that Piper Super Cub airplane of his. This plane was a mechanism of absolute psychological terror. He would fly his victims. Far from the city, deep into the Alaskan bush. He would fly them to his remote cabin on the Nick River or to other even more isolated locations. I want you to imagine this. Imagine being taken from the city, the only city for like hundreds of miles, right? Flown in this tiny, rattling POS plane over an empty, endless landscape of snow and ice and trees, and then just dropped off there. Just dropped. This act of isolation, and not just isolation, geographic isolation, instantly would disorient them. It would disorient anyone, right? It would strip you of all of your bearings, all of your hope, and any chance that you had of being found or of escaping. It was meticulous, and it was purposeful. It was the first stage in Bob psychologically breaking these women. Step four was the game. What happened next is Robert Hansen's very unique, very horrifying signature. After flying these women to this middle of nowhere, he would release them and he would begin the game. He would hunt them down like animals through this Alaskan bush. He would pursue them with his .223 Ruger Mini 14 rifle, and hunting knives in tow. And this was not a method of disposal either. This was the entire point. This was the whole point. This was the complete ritualized acting out of his core pathology, which was sexual sadism. Criminologists define this term as deriving pleasure, sexual or otherwise, from the infliction of either physical or psychological pain. And Hansen's hunt was a perfectly constructed scenario to achieve exactly that. One analysis noted that sadists like Hansen, quote, wanted their victims to fight back and ask for mercy, which intensified their sexual gratification. The hunt itself would actually force the victim to fight back, right? To run, to hide. And it terrified them. It maximized their terror And in doing so, it maximized his gratification. This was the ultimate grotesque reversal of this man's childhood and youth, right? That powerless little boy finally got to be the all powerful one, the one that was holding that power of life and death, the ultimate power, right? And he was achieving what psychologists refer to as infantile omnipotence. This is the regaining of lost power of his youth. And to do this, in order to do this, he had to dehumanize these victims. He made a very clean distinction between the good girls and the bad girls. The good girls, he would sexually harm, assault, and then he would release. But the bad girls, right, the prostitutes, the sex workers, the dancers, in his very warped, deluded mind, they deserved to die. And this allowed him to see them as trophies, right, as animals. And the most explicit, chilling proof of this mechanism was a quote that he actually later gave to investigators. Do you know what he said? He said, "You cannot grape a prostitute." Yeah. Now, ugh, ugh, that's how I feel. Okay. Now, Robert Hansen confessed to 17 murders. And I know what you're thinking, like, oh, he confessed? Like, how do we know that this man who was seeking power wasn't just lying or exaggerating, right? It's a fair question. It's a fair question. I asked it myself, right? But the answer is actually why the case is so chillingly solid. We know because of this three-part cocktail of terror, right? We have part one, physical evidence, right? The bodies that they did find, the linkings to ballistics. We have part two, his trophies, right? This is the items that he kept from his victims. And then we have part three, which was his confessions, but it wasn't just as simple as like, I did it. It was literally a map guided tour of his own evil, which we will get to. So when I go through this list of victims, because you know I'm going to talk about every single one that I can, because that's my MO, naming these women, naming these victims, right? When I go through this list, I want you to know that every single one of these names is backed up by either a body, trophy, his confession, or in some cases, all three of those things. In doing my research, it is suspected that his first victim may have been a young woman by the name of Celia Van Zanten. She was 18 years old. She disappeared on December 22nd, 1971, and she froze to death. Hansen actually denied this one, but the timing of it is just very suspicious to a lot of like investigators and researchers. So then we have the young ladies, Megan Emmerich. She was 17 years old and she died in 1973. And then we have Mary Kay Till. She was 23 years old and she died in 1975. Both of these women vanished from Seward, Alaska. Their bodies were actually never found. And these are actually two that he remained very cagey about. In fact, when he showed police his map, he refused to identify these two exes. Mind you, this is his map. We'll get there. Authorities have always suspected that those two exes belonged to Megan and Mary. Then there is the young woman who would haunt this case for decades. On July 21st, 1980, a body was found by Eklutna Road. She was so decomposed that she could never be identified. She became known as Eklutna Annie. Hansen later stated that she was his first murder victim, probably in 1979. 1980 was a very busy year for Bob the Baker. Joanna Messina, 24, she vanished in May of that year. Her body was found in a gravel pit in July. This was a pure, unadulterated confession. He claimed that she offered him sex for cash, and in his sick mind, when she did that, it signed her death warrant. Roxanne Eastland, she was 24 years old. She vanished in June of that year. Her body was never found. We know about her for one reason. When he finally confessed to everything, he pointed to one of those X's on his map and he just admitted to killing her. Lisa Futrell, she was 41 years old. She vanished in September of 1980. Her body wouldn't be found for 4 years, but her location was also one of the X's on Bob the Baker's map. In 1981, Malai Larson, she was 28 years old. She was reported missing. On November 17th, 1981, Sherry Morrow, 23. She was an exotic dancer. She told her friends that she was meeting a photographer for a $300 nude photo shoot. She was never seen again. Her body would be found a year later by hunters on the bank of the Nick River. This was a key discovery. Ballistics found the 222 shell casings nearby, and the detail that chilled investigators. Her body was fully clothed, and her clothes had no bullet holes. He had shot her nude and then redressed her body. On December 2nd, 1981, a woman by the name of Andrea Altieri. She was 22 years old. She was an exotic dancer who went by the name Fish. She vanished. Her body was never found. So how do we know this is how? Because when police raided Hansen's attic, they found her fish necklace. He had kept the trophy of her. He also gave a full confession in regards to her. He said that he took her to the Nicked Arm Bridge, killed her, and then threw her body, which was weighted down, into the water. The spree continued. We have Sue Luna. She was 23 years old. She vanished in May of 1982. Same story, $300 offer. He confessed to this one, and her body was later found where he had indicated that it would be. Tamara Peterson, she was 23 years old. She was a dancer. She vanished in August of 1982. Same offer, and her body was only found after Hansen confessed and pointed to her location on his map. Robin Pelkey, she was 19 years old. She was killed around 1982 to 1983. Her body was unidentified for 37 years. For 37 years, this poor girl was only known as Horseshoe Harriet. And then we have Angela Fettern. She was 24 years old. She was also a dancer. She vanished in February of 1983. We have Dylan Sugar Frey, who was 22 years old and vanished in March of 1983. We have Teresa Watson, 22 years old. That's just days later, March 25th. 1983, and also lured by $300. He actually confessed that he left her body unburied because the ground was still frozen. On April 25th, 1983, Paula Goulding, a 17-year-old exotic dancer, disappeared. Her body would be the next one found on September 2nd, 1983, by the Nick River near Sherry Morrow. And just like with Sherry Morrow, they found those 223 shell casings. These women are not just names in this case. They are not just statistics. They were daughters. Some were mothers. They were young women drawn to the promise of boomtown money, and they fell into the crosshairs of a predator who had perfected the art of invisibility and exploitation. But by 1983, Hansen was getting a little arrogant. He was getting sloppy, as most of these predators do. And his increasingly narcissistic belief that he was invincible was about to lead to his downfall. So the date is June 13th, 1983, and this is the day that the entire case breaks wide open. Robert Hansen abducts a 17-year-old named Cindy Paulson. She was at the time a sex worker in Anchorage, Alaska, but This time, his routine changes. Maybe he was in a hurry. I don't know. Maybe he had just become that arrogant, as does happen. He doesn't fly her out to the woods. Not yet. Actually, this time, he takes her to his home. His home. There, in his home, he chained her from the ceiling of his den and then raped and tortured her repeatedly. His narcissistic blind spot is what he did next. What did he do next, Tiff? You ask? Let me tell you. His plan was still to fly her to the wilderness to be his next trophy. And so he gets in his car with Cindy in tow, and he drives that car to the very public Merrill Field Airport. He's busy loading his plane, the Piper Super Cub, right? He's probably already imagining that hunt. But the other thing that he's doing is underestimating our girl, Cindy Paulson. He's gravely underestimating our girl. While his back was turned, Cindy, barefoot, half nude and still in handcuffs, mind you, manages to get out of that car and she hauls ass. She runs for her life. She runs to nearby 6th Avenue and she flags down a passing truck driver named Robert Yount. Cindy is found by this truck driver, half naked and handcuffed, hitchhiking and hysterical. That was the quote. This is it. This is it, right? This is the smoking gun. You've got a live victim. She's still in chains and handcuffs. She's got a too horrific to be true story. Case closed, right? Oh, you sweet summer child. No, of course not. Of course not. The Anchorage Police Department, right? APD. These officers pick up Miss Paulson from a nearby motel. They take her statement. They take her to the airport. At the airport, she identifies Hansen's plane. She says, that's the one. That one right there. That's what I got in. A security guard at the airport corroborates her story, and he even noted the license plate of Hansen's car. They go to Hansen's house, and the interior matches Cindy Paulson's detailed description that she gave, where she was being held and bound and tortured. Slam dunk, right? Slam dunk. So what do? They bring Robert Hansen in for questioning, obviously, and he just lies. He lies. He turns on that Bob the Baker charm, right? The stutter, the meek demeanor. He denies everything. He tells the police that she's a sex worker and she was trying to extort him. And to seal the deal, he provides an alibi from his friend, a man named John Henning. And the Anchorage Police Department, they did what we know they would do, right? No. What did they do? They believed him. They believed him. They believed him. They believed the stuttering baker over the 17-year-old girl that they found half nude and in handcuffs. And then what did they do? They let Bob go. They let him go. It is completely acceptable at this point to just pause and let that outrage sink in. It is also completely acceptable for you right now, my beautiful unraveler, to scream at your screen. Cindy Paulson's testimony, right? The most important break in a decade-long killing spree was dismissed as the, quote, tale of a whore, unquote. But one man was not buying this shit. Not for a single second. His name was Glenn Floethy, and he was an APD. He was an Alaska State Trooper. Floethy was the lead investigator on the bodies being found by the Knik River. Sherry Morrow, for instance, or Paula Golding. Floethy knew. He knew in his gut that he had a serial killer on his hands. He had the 223 shell casings. He knew that this was a hunter. And when Floethy heard Cindy Paulson's story, a story that his APD colleagues had dismissed, he believed her. He said that her account was, quote, eerily like, unquote, the scenarios that he had been imagining for the victims that he had been working on. Floethy was completely convinced, but he was stuck. He had a suspect who fit, right? And he had this surviving witness that nobody believed. So he needed something to bridge that gap. So Floethy made a call that would change forensic history. He called the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit in Quantico, Virginia, and he got on the phone with a man named John E. Douglas. Yes, that John Douglas, the mind hunter himself. Floethy laid it all out at that point. The recovered bodies, right? Eklutna Annie, Messina, Morrow, the wilderness graves, the 223 casings, the presumed hunter MO. Douglas listened, and he sent back a criminal profile that was so precise, it is still to this day the stuff of legend. Douglas theorized that the killer would be as follows. This was his criminal profile. Number one, he would be an experienced hunter, obviously. Number two, he would possess very low self-esteem. Thanks, Iowa. And number three, he would have a history of being rejected by women. Ding, ding, ding. He would also be psychologically compelled to keep souvenirs of his kills, like jewelry. And then the uncanny detail, Douglas suggested that the assailant might have a stutter. He said it. Floethy had his man. He had his man. Paulson, Floethy, Douglas triad had just solved this case, essentially. Paulson was the living evidence. Floethy was this connective intuition linking the assault to the murders, and Douglas provided the psychological key. This profile gave Floethy the confidence and also the ammunition that he needed to look past the Mousy Baker mask and see this stuttering, rejected, souvenir-keeping hunter that fit every single profile point. The hunt for the hunter, it was about to end. So now they're armed. They're armed with Cindy Paulson's testimony. They have the 223 ballistics, and now they have this laser-focused FBI profile. And so investigators finally got the search warrants that they needed. On October 27th, 1983, they hit the Hansens' house, his plane, and his bakery. Trooper Glenn Flothi was at the house, and as they recounted, they were searching everywhere and they were finding nothing. They were finding absolutely nothing. Found a bunch of guns, which in Alaska is like finding water in the ocean, right? Everybody has them. They're fucking everywhere. Hansen was in an interview room across town, calm as ever, spinning his same old stories. He was talking the same old stuttery, muttery, mousy bakery bullshit that he always, did. Lothy was getting nervous. Their key witness, Cindy Paulson, she had actually disappeared again. She went back to the Anchorage nightlife. And so the entire case was just kind of threatening to fall apart at this point. And then, right as they were about to give up, one of the officers discovered it. They discovered it, a hidden space tucked away in the attic rafters. And inside was the trophy room. The attic. The attic. A perfect metaphor for his psychology. A dark, hidden compartment of his life existing directly above his normal family, where he curated a narcissistic shrine to his kills. The evidence in that attic was overwhelming. It was overwhelming. And it was not circumstantial. This was a direct history of his crimes. In that attic, they found a driver's license, various ID cards, actually, newspaper clippings about the murders, and they found various pieces of jewelry, including, as I mentioned, a very specific fish necklace, all belonging to the dead and missing women. They also found the two most important pieces of evidence in this case. Number one, they found the weapon tucked away in that attic was his 223 Ruger Mini 14 rifle, the exact weapon that they were looking for. And number two, the map, an aviation map to be precise. According to some reports, it was hidden in the headboard of his bed. And on this map were dozens of X's. A map with X's on it, which, as true crimers, we all know is never a good sign. This was actually his human trophy log. This was his grave map. On November 3rd, 1983, grand jury finally indicted Robert Hansen. On November 20th, 1983, ballistic tests all came back. The shell casings found at the grave sites of Sherry Murrow and Paula Goulding, quote, had all been fired by Hansen's rifle, unquote. It was a perfect match. And finally, game over. Game over, Hansen. Robert Hansen was screwed. He was screwed. He was indicted, finally, for the assault and kidnapping of Cindy Paulson, for weapons charges, for theft, and the ballistics and the trophies tied him to these murders. His case was hopeless. It was hopeless. His defense attorney, his name was Fred Dewey. He set up a meeting with the prosecution. This included Anchorage District Attorney Victor Crumb. No Harry Potter fans, not this Victor Crumb, but another Victor Crumb. And Assistant DA Frank Rothschild. The prosecution had a problem, but it turned out to be a good problem. They knew that they could convict Hansen for the 4 murders where they had the most incriminating evidence, and those murders were Paula Goulding, Joanna Messina, Sherry Morrow, and Eklutna Annie, right? But the map that Hansen himself had kept in his own attic, supposedly in the headboard of a bed, had way more than 4 X's on it. Way more. Way more. And there were at least 13 other women missing at this point. Women that they had strongly suspected that he had killed. A trial for those 4 would be a slam dunk. But it would never find the other bodies, and it would never give those 13 other families closure and closure that they deserved, that they needed. So Rothschild and Crumb made a brilliant, pragmatic, and frankly heroic choice, in my opinion. They offered a plea agreement. I don't always like plea agreements, but in this case, the deal was simple. Bob, we will only charge you with the 4 murders that we can already prove. In exchange, you give us everything. You give us a full confession to all of it, and you must cooperating in locating all of the grave sites. This is a masterstroke. They traded 13 redundant life sentences for answers. I wish that people would do this now, that prosecutors would do this now. They prioritized closure for 13 families over the purely punitive act of 17 separate trials. Hansen, at this point, and I'm sure to his own poor baby detriment, was stripped of all of his power. And so he accepted this deal. On February 18th, 1984, Robert Hansen pled guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder. And very soon after, as stipulated, Robert Hansen, quote, accompanied investigators on a helicopter flight where he pointed out the grave sites, unquote. I want all of you beautiful unravelers to really absorb the pathetic, profound irony of this moment. The man whose entire pathology was built on the power of his airplane was now a prisoner in a helicopter that he had no control over, right? The man who curated a secret trophy map of his kills was now forced to use that same map as a guide for the police. The hunter was now being forced to hunt his own victims for the benefit of the very system that he thought he had fooled. This act, forcing him to retrace his steps as a shackled prisoner, was the ultimate, final, and total stripping of the power, control, and dominance that he had craved his entire pathetic fucking life. During this flight and his confessions, he admitted to murdering 17 women. 17 women. And sexually assaulting over 30 women. He led them to 12 previously unknown grave sites. For his crimes, Robert Christian Hansen was sentenced to 461 years in prison without the possibility of parole. He was initially shipped out of state to the United States Penitentiary in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, but in 1988, he was returned to Alaska, where he spent the majority of his life incarcerated at Spring Creek Correctional Center, a maximum security facility in Seward. My daughter is fighting for her life on Roblox right now. In case anyone was curious what that was in the background, if you can hear it, I can. Robert Hansen would occasionally write letters, including one to the Associated Press in 2006, complaining that journalists had, quote, hurt my family so very much. The audacity. Robert Hansen died in prison on August 21st, 2014 at the ripe old age, far too ripe in my opinion, old age of 75. He had been in rapidly declining health for over a year. He was moved to the Alaska Regional Hospital in Anchorage, and he died of natural causes and had a DNR, or do not resuscitate, order on file. Robert Hansen's cultural legacy is, well, exactly what you would expect, right? His story is so uniquely cinematic, so horrifyingly most dangerous game that obviously it was destined for media. The definitive book is Butcher Baker, the true account of an Alaskan serial killer, which was co-authored by, wait for it, one of the actual Alaska state troopers who investigated the case, Walter Gilmore. And in 2013, the film The Frozen Ground was released. It starred John Cusack doing his best creepy calm as Hansen and Nicolas Cage as Sergeant Jack Halcombe, a character based on our hero, Glenn Flothi. Vanessa Hudgens played the role of Cindy Paulson, who was our survivor who broke this entire case. And of course, this case is the staple of true crime TV. We have an episode of the FBI files called The Hunter's Game. We have the episode of Mark of a Killer called Hunted to Death. And we have The Butcher Baker, Mind of a Monster, which features actually Robert Hansen's final taped confession. But his forensic legacy, in my opinion, is far more interesting than the made-for-TV stuff, right? The Hansen case is a perfect bridge between two very distinct eras of solving crimes. Era one, right? We have the 1980s. The case was a watershed moment for the FBI's behavioral science unit. It was solved by psychology, right? John Douglas's profile, where he predicted the stutter, the souvenirs, the rejection that his subject had faced. It was so stunningly accurate that it served as a very powerful public validation for the first time of criminal profiling as a legitimate investigative tool. So cool. That's so cool, right? It was the perfect proof of Douglas's core tenet, right? Behavior reflects personality. Era number two, the 2020s, because let me explain something to you. Believe it or not, this case is still active, and its lingering mysteries are being solved by a science that didn't exist in 1983. And that science is genetic genealogy. For decades, two of Hansen's victims remained Jane Does. One of these victims was known as Horseshoe Harriet. We mentioned her, and for 37 years, that was her name. But in August of 2021, the Alaska Bureau of Investigation's Cold Case Unit launched a new effort. They generated a new DNA profile. They uploaded it to a genetic genealogy database, and they got a match. And from there, they started building a family tree. They found one of Horseshoe Harriet's relatives in Arkansas. They got a kinship DNA sample. And in September of 2021, they confirmed her identity. And Horseshoe Harriet finally got her name back. She was known as Robin Pelkey, who I mentioned earlier. She was 19 years old. She was born in Colorado. She had been living in Anchorage. The state actually, once they found out who she was, they actually purchased a new grave marker for her at Anchorage Memorial Park Cemetery. But here's the final chilling coda here. The most horrifying validation of our killer, Robert Hansen's entire victim selection strategy. When investigators were building Robin Pelkey's history, they checked the official records, all the official records. No record was found reporting her missing. Nothing. There was nothing. He was right. He was right. He had correctly calculated that he could hunt and murder these women and no one would ever even know that they were gone. Robin Pelkey's name was finally given back. But there is one ghost that remains. We talked about her. Eklutna Annie. Eklutna Annie. This woman is the woman who was found by the power lines in 1980, one that he claimed was his very first murder victim, right? And despite clay busts and 3D reconstructions, Eklutna Annie remains to this day the last unidentified victim of Robert Hansen. She is the beginning of his story, and for right now, she is also the end. Robert Hansen wasn't a monster in the mythical sense. He was a man, a pathetic, bullied, rage-filled man who took his profound powerlessness and instead of trying to heal that, he weaponized it. He turned his deep-seated sexual sadism and his narcissistic need for control into a very grotesque, deadly sport. He was a husband. He was a father. He was a baker. And for 12 years, in the cold and in the darkness of the midnight sun, he was a nightmare. And so, Unravelers, that is tonight's name off of the naughty list. Another shadow pulled out of that beautiful holiday glow. And if you're still here with me, leaning in and catching every detail, I just want to say thank you. You are the entire reason that this little corner of the internet feels like a true crime holiday party, minus the eggnog plus all of the evidence boards, if something like that exists. It does here. It does here. Your support, your messages, your shares, your encouragement, all of this is what keeps this tiny little baby channel alive. And I'm so grateful for every single one of you. And if you haven't already, hit like, hit subscribe, hit that bell so that you don't miss that next name on our seasonal naughty list. Trust me, you will want to be here when we unwrap it. Until then, please stay safe, keep asking questions, and keep unraveling. Love you.